Welcome to Reformed Thinking. What if I told you that a single grammatical quirk in a 2,000-year-old letter could completely rewrite a modern church budget?
I mean, that sounds like a stretch, but it is actually entirely accurate.
Right. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's an expectation of precision. It is like engineering.
Mm.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor points to the fracture. The situation is binary.
Yeah, the bone is broken, or it is intact. We favor that kind of visible, neat categorization because, well, it removes ambiguity.
The diagnosis is clean and the treatment plan is obvious, but then you step into the world of evaluating ancient texts and suddenly that x-ray machine seems to short circuit.
It really is.
We are looking at a theological and historical landscape that is, honestly, quite murky. You start reading instructions written thousands of years ago, and the natural human inclination is to assume certain commands were restricted to the people alive at that specific moment in history.
Right, that you think that instruction was for them in their cultural context, not for us today.
Yes, precisely. But if a historical instruction is an ongoing mandate, it completely alters how a local congregation functions right now. It dictates the operating procedure of global missions.
Assuming an instruction is confined to the past lets us off the hook. We treat the text as trivia rather than a present-day obligation.
Right.
For the believer trying to align their life and their local congregation with biblical commands, getting the diagnosis right on these specific texts carries tremendous gravity. Misinterpreting the timeline of a command leads to misplaced resources and flawed methodologies.
That brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are investigating a highly specific, highly debated phrase from the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 16. The phrase is, "To the Jew first, and also to the Greek."
It is a massive topic.
It is. To help us analyze this, we have some fascinating source material. We are looking at excerpts from Arnold G. Fruchtenbaum's work, To the Jew First in the New Millennium, a dispensational perspective, alongside some very significant historical statements tied to the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Those sources provide a robust theological framework. They force hard questions regarding continuity. Fruchtenbaum looks at the text through his specific theological lens, and the Westminster standards represent historic Protestant thought.
And I think people might assume those two streams of thought are completely disconnected.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But they both converge on this issue in ways that might surprise people. Both frameworks recognize that God's covenantal actions follow a specific shape and sequence.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at this phrase from the Apostle Paul, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. The core debate we have to resolve for you today is this. Is this phrase a history lesson, or is it a current operating procedure for global missions?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Is Paul saying this is how the events unfolded in the past? Or is he saying this is the sequence you must follow today, tomorrow, and until the end of the age?
To evaluate this accurately, we have to bypass our modern assumptions and look at the literal grammar of the ancient Greek text used by the Apostle Paul. Guessing at his intent is insufficient.
We have to look at the mechanics of the sentence he constructed.
Yes. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul writes that he is not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the saving force of God to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek.
We had to paraphrase a bit there to capture the essence of the original language, but the meaning is clear. The gospel is God's strength for salvation.
That captures the essence beautifully. Let us break down the two main Greek verbs in that sentence. The first verb is epishinomai, which translates to be ashamed.
Okay.
Paul states, I am not ashamed.
Oh.
This verb is in the Greek present tense. In Greek grammar, the present tense often shows a continuous state or action.
So he is indicating he is continuously, constantly not ashamed of the gospel.
Right. It is his perpetual state of mind.
He's not saying he was unashamed yesterday, but might be embarrassed today if the cultural winds shift. It is a constant reality for him, a fixed posture.
That is a great way to put it. The second verb in the passage is eston, which translates simply as is. The gospel is the saving force of God.
Another present tense verb, right?
Yes, this verb is also in the present tense, again showing continuous action. And then we hit the critical word, proton, translated as first. It is the neuter form of the word protos.
Let me stop you there, because this is where the debate really centers.
It does. In Greek, proton can mean first in time, first in place, first in order, first in sequence, or first in degree and priority.
Hold on, I am losing the thread slightly here. That word proton carries a lot of weight.
No.
It is not just about who stood in line first at a bakery.
No, not at all.
It can mean foremost in rank or priority, like a first violin in an orchestra. How do we know which definition Paul intended?
This brings us to a crucial grammatical concept called the gnomic present tense. The gnomic present is used to communicate a universal truth.
A universal truth. Okay.
Right. It does not describe an event happening right now. It describes a reality that is always true across all time and circumstances.
I need an example. Are you saying it works like a proverb or a physical law? Like saying, water boils at 212 degrees.
That is a perfect parallel. Fruchtenbaum's text provides another helpful analogy for this gnomic present tense. Think of the phrase, honesty is the best policy.
Sure, we all know that one.
When someone says that, they do not mean honesty was the best policy back in 1995. But today, we have moved on to something else.
No, of course not.
They mean honesty is always the best policy. It is a universal, ongoing reality.
So we have this verb is in the gnomic present tense. The gospel is the strength of God for salvation. It always was, it is right now, and it always will be.
Here's the interpretive key. We have to evaluate what that verb is controls in the sentence.
What do you mean by controls?
Well, does the verb esten only control the middle clause, meaning the gospel is the strength of God? Or does it also control the final clause, meaning the gospel is to the Jew first?
Oh, I see.
If the present tense verb is controls both clauses, then the mandate to the Jew first is continuous. It is a universal truth, just like the gospel being the strength of God is a universal truth.
If we look at the alternative, the logic really falls apart. If the grammar signifies a universal truth, treating the phrase to the Jew first as a closed historical event logically forces a person to apply that same past tense to the rest of the sentence.
Exactly. That is spot on.
You would have to say the gospel was only the strength of God in the past, but it is no longer the strength of God today. Obviously, no Christian believes that. The saving force of God is just as active today as it was in the first century.
Splitting the verse down the middle based on personal preference breaks the grammatical structure. If the first half is a perpetual reality, consistency demands. The second half is also a perpetual reality. The procedure remains as active as the salvation it proclaims.
So what does this all mean? How have the major thinkers and scholars debated this grammar over the centuries? Because if it is this grammatically clear, I assume everyone just falls in line and agrees, right?
Not at all. Looking at the historical theologians reveals a massive tension. Let us review the views of men like Charles Hodge, William Shedd, and J.P. McBeth.
These are heavyweights in historical theology.
They absolutely are. Charles Hodge and William Shedd look at Romans 1, verse 16, and argue that the word first is purely historical.
Meaning they think it just describes a timeline of events. The Messiah came from the Jewish people, the gospel was preached in Jerusalem initially, and then it moved on to the Gentiles. A timeline. Nothing more.
Right. They argue that applying an ongoing priority to the Jewish people contradicts other verses that talk about equality and salvation. They relegate first to a historical footnote in chapter 1.
But wait, Paul uses this exact same phrase again in the very next chapter. He repeats it word for word.
He does. In Romans chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, what's fascinating here is where the tension becomes a glaring double standard.
How so?
Romans 2, verse 9 speaks of judgment, tribulation, and anguish coming upon every soul that does evil, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And verse 10 speaks of glory, honor, and peace to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also to the Greek.
Let me guess. Hodge and Shedd change their interpretation when they get to chapter 2.
They shift gears completely. For Romans chapter 2, Hodge writes that first expresses order or preeminence.
Wow.
He says the Jewish person will be punished more severely because of higher privileges, making first equivalent to especially. Shedd does the same thing. He says preeminence in privileges carries preeminence in condemnation.
That is wild.
They both view first in chapter 2 as an ongoing perpetual principle of priority.
That is baffling.
Yeah.
Why is the priority of judgment and wrath treated as an ongoing eternal reality, while the priority of the gospel's saving force in chapter 1 is dismissed as a thing of the past?
It is a clear inconsistency.
It seems like they are bending the text to fit a theological discomfort with the idea of ongoing Jewish priority in evangelism.
It points to a theological framework that struggles to accommodate ongoing positive distinctions. We see this even more starkly in the writings of J.P. McBeth.
Okay, what does he say?
When commenting on chapter 2, McBeth claims that the Jewish people receive first place in judgment because of what he calls defaulted responsibility.
Let's pause there. What does defaulted responsibility mean in plain English?
McBeth argues that because God gave them the scriptures and the covenants, they had greater ability in calling. When they failed to uphold that calling, they defaulted on their responsibility.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
Therefore, he says, the person most responsible is most guilty when unfaithful to a trust. Consequently, they are first in line for judgment.
I have to push back hard on Macbeth's logic there. If he argues that ability and calling bring added responsibility, which then leads to first place in judgment, why is there such a reluctance to assign first place in rewards or blessing or gospel priority?
That is the crucial question.
There is a huge irony in affirming that God maintains a strict order for pouring out judgment, but denying that he maintains that same strict order for pouring out grace. You cannot enthusiastically say, judgment for the Jew first, yes, and then say, salvation to the Jew first, no.
The inconsistency is striking. It reveals a theological framework eager to assign covenantal curses, but hesitant to acknowledge ongoing covenantal blessings or procedural priority.
Just to make sure we are speaking the same language, when you say covenantal curses, you mean the negative consequences God promised if the ancient Israelites broke their agreement with him, right? Things like exile or severe judgment.
That hits the mark. The selective reading of Paul's theology embraces the curses, but historically isolates the blessings.
This tension forces us to seek out scholars who maintain a consistent view across both chapters of Romans. We cannot accept a framework that changes the definition of a word from one chapter to the next just to avoid an uncomfortable conclusion.
I agree completely.
That brings us to John Murray and Douglas Moo, who introduce what we can call the priority of relevance.
John Murray is a titan of Reformed theology, and his commentary on the book of Romans is highly regarded. Murray looks at Romans chapter 1, verse 16, and flatly denies that the priority is only about time.
So he rejects the purely historical view.
He does. He argues there is no suggestion in the text that first is just chronological. Instead, he states the gospel has primary relevance to the Jewish people because they were specifically chosen by God to receive the promises.
He connects the gospel directly to the historic covenants. The gospel is the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so naturally it possesses a primary intrinsic relevance to their descendants.
Yes, exactly. I should say you have it right.
It is not a random starting point, it is a theological necessity.
Douglas Moo, another highly respected commentator, although a historic premillennialist, agrees with Murray on this specific point.
Wait, before we move on, for someone who isn't steeped in seminary terminology, what does being a historic premillennialist actually mean in the context of this argument? Why does it matter that me is one while Murray was not?
That is a great question. A historic premillennialist believes that Jesus will return physically to earth to reign for a literal 1,000 years before the final judgment. More relevant to this discussion, they generally believe that national Israel still has a distinct role in God's future plans.
Okay, that makes sense.
John Murray, on the other hand, operated from an amillennial perspective, which tends to view the church as the new spiritual Israel fulfilling those promises now.
Two very different viewpoints.
Very different. The fact that Moo and Murray, representing two very different views on end times theology, agree on the ongoing priority in Romans chapter 1 shows how strong the textual evidence is. Moo notes that in Romans, Paul insists the promises of God have a special ongoing application to Israel today.
This shifts the entire debate. We are no longer talking about historical trivia who heard the sermon first in the year 33. We are talking about theological reality.
It really elevates the conversation.
If we carry this priority of relevance into the future, it changes how we view the end of the age. Murray points out that the final judgment will take this priority into account, both for retribution and for bliss. The final administration of reward will honor this divine order.
It is a much more consistent hermeneutic. It respects the text without bending it. However, while Murray and Moo excel at defining the theological reality, they fall short of defining how this impacts modern-day street-level evangelism.
Right. They establish the theory, but they leave a gap when it comes to the practical execution for a local church today.
They give us the what and the why, but miss the how. And that is where scholars like C.K. Barrett and Sanford C. Mills step in.
What do they add to the conversation?
They look at this same grammar and the same theological priority, and they insist it must translate into ongoing literal action today. Mills, for instance, argues that Paul's declaration is without qualification, and is just as applicable today as it was in the first century.
So they take it from the textbook to the pavement?
But they do. Mills observes Paul's actual behavior. He points out that everywhere Paul went, from city to city, he inevitably and invariably went to the Jewish population first. For Mills, the theology dictates the methodology.
While commentaries debate theory all day long, parsing Greek verbs in a library, someone has to step out the door and do the work. We need to look at someone who took this theology out of the academy and applied it to the streets.
We find that practical application in Joseph Hoffman Cohn. He was the General Secretary of the American Board of Missions to the Jews for many years.
A guy actually doing the work.
Yes, Cohn did not just write about the phrase, "to the Jew first." He built a massive missional organization around it. He applied it rigorously to two specific areas, literal evangelism and financial giving.
Cohn's writings from the early 20th century are fascinating because he was constantly fielding objections from other Christians. In 1940, he wrote a response to a Christian who claimed they were living in the church age, and therefore all distinctions between people were erased.
People still make that argument today.
This person argued that because Galatians says there is neither Jew nor Greek in Christ, the mandate of Romans chapter 1 was canceled.
Cohn's response was sharp and deeply biblical. He outlined a distinction based on 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 32, where Paul writes, "Give no offense, either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God." Cohn pointed out that the world is divided into three distinct groups: Jews, Gentiles, and the Church of God.
This is a brilliant clarification. Inside the church, among those who have already believed, all are one. There is no distinction in value or standing before God. But outside the church, in the realm of evangelism, looking out at the unbelieving world, the biblical categories remain intact. The order for reaching them remains intact.
Cohn used a fantastic anecdote to illustrate this. He shared a story about a banker responding to a Christian who rejected the "to the Jew first" doctrine. The banker asked the man, "In what age are we living now?" The man replied, "In the church age, of course."
Okay, setting the trap.
Then the banker asked, "In what age did Paul write Romans chapter 1, verse 16? The man had to answer, "In the church age."
The trap snaps shut. The banker says, "Then there you have your answer." Whatever was true in the days when Paul wrote the epistle to the Romans is just as true this very moment, for it is one and the same dispensation.
It is a brilliant way to phrase it.
It is such a clean, logical argument. If the church age has not ended, then the operating instructions given to the church have not expired.
Cohn recognized that God does not arbitrarily change his methods midstream. But Cohn also knew he needed to explain the logic behind God establishing this order. People assumed first meant favoritism or superiority.
Yeah, that is a huge hang-up for a lot of people.
To counter this, Cohn provided an incredibly helpful analogy about building a fire in a stove.
I love this analogy. Break it down for us.
Cohn explained that when you build a fire, you start by putting paper in the grate. On top of the paper, you put light wood, then heavier wood, and finally coal. This specific sequence produces a strong, lasting fire.
Makes complete sense.
Now, suppose someone says, "I do not like putting the paper in first. I will put the coal in first, then the wood, then the paper." Obviously, you will not get a fire. The order matters.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you put the paper in first, you are not saying paper is inherently better than coal. Paper is not superior to wood. It is simply the necessary material to start the sequence.
Spot.
It has a specific function in the process of creating the fire. Let me play with this analogy for a second. If I'm freezing in a cabin, my goal is to get the coal burning, because coal provides the lasting heat to warm the whole room. But I cannot hold a match directly to a lump of coal. It will just scorch the surface and go out. I have to start with the paper.
That is the core of Cohn's argument. To the Jew first does not mean the Jewish person is better than the Gentile. It does not mean they have preference in their inherent worth. It simply means this is God's divine order for evangelizing the world. There is a peculiar function God ordained for Israel in the propagation of the gospel. Reversing the order stifles the fire.
It frames the mandate not as ethnic favoritism, but as a divine functional mechanism for reaching the whole world. It is the procedure designed by the architect of salvation, and Cohn noted that the church's refusal to follow this order for 2 millennia has resulted in massive loss for the church itself. We have been trying to light the coal without the paper.
It is a tragic oversight. If we accept that this is the divine mechanism, the necessary sequence for global missions, the immediate question becomes practical.
Which is, how does a local church today actually do this? How does a congregation in a town with very few Jewish people fulfill a mandate to take the gospel to the Jew first?
To answer that, we have to look at the intersection of dispensational strategy and the theological framework of the Westminster Confession. These two streams help us define the practical application. Fruchtenbaum looks at this through a dispensational lens and points out the relationship between the Great Commission and Romans chapter 1, verse 16.
Okay, lay that out for us.
In Matthew 28, Jesus gives the Great Commission. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. That is the overarching goal. That is the destination. But Romans chapter 1 provides the procedure. It is the roadmap for how to reach that destination. The goal is the whole world. The procedure is to start with the Jewish people.
And this procedural view aligns remarkably well with historic Reformed thought. Look at the Westminster Larger Catechism, specifically the answer to question 191.
That is a very telling document.
Now, for those who might not know, the Westminster Larger Catechism is a massive teaching document written in the 1640s that systematically outlines Protestant theology. Question 191 asks what we pray for in the second petition of the Lord's Prayer, which is, Thy kingdom come.
And the answer is very specific.
It is. The answer explicitly states we pray that the gospel be propagated throughout the world, the Jews called, and the fullness of the Gentiles brought in. There is a recognized sequence there.
We see this sequence honored in actions taken by modern Reformed bodies. The Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA, passed an overture on Jewish evangelism that is highly relevant here. The overture explicitly condemns as the worst form of anti-Semitism the act of withholding the gospel from the Jewish people.
That is a staggering statement. Withholding the gospel is anti-Semitism. Why? Because you are denying them the very saving force of God designed for their salvation.
The overture also strongly rejects what is known as the two-covenant theory.
Let us unpack that term. What is the two-covenant theory, and why does the PCA consider it so dangerous?
The two-covenant theory is the false teaching that Jewish people have a separate path to salvation simply because of the original Abrahamic covenant and therefore do not need to believe in Jesus.
Okay.
It suggests God maintains one covenant for Jews and a separate new covenant for Gentiles. The PCA rightly identifies this as heresy because it denies the necessity of the completed atonement. Sacrifice of the Messiah is required for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike.
So, if the atonement is necessary for everyone, and the procedure is to the Jew first, how does a local church fulfill this if they cannot go physically? Fruchtenbaum makes a helpful distinction between active evangelism and passive evangelism.
Active evangelism is the physical act of going out, doing the work of an evangelist, speaking to people face to face.
What we normally picture when we hear the word evangelism.
Right. Passive evangelism, on the other hand, is funding, supporting, and praying for those who are doing the active work. Most local churches and individual believers participate in the Great Commission primarily through passive evangelism, through their monetary giving and prayer support.
This connects directly to the listener's everyday life. When you're sitting at the kitchen table deciding where to send your charitable donations, or when a church mission board is drafting its annual budget, this text demands a specific ordering of those funds.
It creates a real priority list.
The biblical precedent for this passive financial participation is found in Romans chapter 15, verses 25 through 27. Paul writes about Gentile believers in Macedonia and Achaia who took up a collection to send funds to the poor Jewish believers in Jerusalem.
And Paul's reasoning there is vital.
Paul explains the logic behind this offering. He says the Gentiles have been made partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings, and therefore they owe a debt to minister to them in material things.
It is a recognition of spiritual debt. The scriptures, the covenants, the Messiah himself, all came through the Jewish people. The Gentile church is grafted into a Jewish olive tree. Because of that immense spiritual wealth received, there is a tangible, material debt owed.
That reframes giving completely.
It really does. Giving financially to Jewish missions, prioritizing that in a church budget, is a direct, practical way to fulfill the mandate of Romans chapter 1 through passive evangelism.
It makes the mandate actionable for any church anywhere in the world. You fund the paper to light the fire. But this raises a natural question. How do we know this was a strict, non-negotiable procedure and not just a good idea Paul had?
People do bring that up.
People might say, sure, Paul wrote it, but did he actually live it out with that kind of rigidity?
Yeah.
To prove it was a divine operating procedure, we have to look at the actions of the author himself. We have to trace Paul's pattern in the book of Acts.
Tracing Paul's missionary journeys provides the undeniable behavioral evidence for his theology. Remember, Paul was explicitly designated as the apostle to the Gentiles. In Galatians chapter 2, he confirms that Peter was entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, while he was entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised. His specific calling was to reach the Gentile world.
You would think, given that specific job description, Paul would head straight for the pagan temples and the Gentile marketplaces. I am the apostle to the Gentiles, so I am going to the Gentiles. But his actions in the book of Acts show a rigorous, almost stubborn adherence to Romans chapter 1. He never bypassed the procedure to get to his primary audience.
Let us look at a few specific examples. In Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are in Antioch of Pisidia. They go into the synagogue on the Sabbath. After facing rejection from the majority of the Jewish population there, Paul makes a striking statement in verse 46. He says, "It was necessary that the word of God be spoken first to you."
That word necessary is massive. He does not say it was historically convenient or it was my personal preference. He says it was necessary. Why? Because it is a theological necessity dictated by the order God established. He had to fulfill the requirement before he could legitimately turn his focus to the Gentiles in that city.
The pattern continues and becomes even more pronounced in cities where the Jewish population was minimal. Take Philippi in Acts chapter 16. Philippi was a Roman colony and had a very small Jewish population. In fact, there were not enough Jewish men to form a traditional synagogue.
According to tradition, you needed 10 men to establish a synagogue, right?
That is correct. Because there was no synagogue, the few Jewish residents would gather by a river outside the city gate for prayer. Now, observe Paul's behavior. He arrives in Philippi, a city filled with Gentiles, his target demographic. He does not immediately start preaching in the city square.
Which is what you would expect him to do.
Right. But he waits until the Sabbath, leaves the city, and goes down to the river just to find this tiny prayer meeting of women.
This is where I have to admit I used to read this story completely differently. I always pictured Paul just taking a stroll by the river and stumbling upon this prayer meeting, but he actively delayed his Gentile ministry.
He put the whole thing on hold.
He sat on his hands in a pagan city, waiting for the Sabbath, seeking out a tiny group by a river, just so he could fulfill the procedural order. If to the Jew first was just a loose guideline, he would have started preaching to the Gentiles on day one. His delay in Philippi proves he viewed the mandate as a strict, non-negotiable protocol.
Then you look at Athens in Acts chapter 17. Athens is the intellectual center of the Gentile world, entirely giving over to idolatry. The text says Paul's spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city full of idols. The idolatry was a Gentile problem. The Jewish population detested the idols as much as Paul did.
You can feel his righteous anger welling up. He is provoked by Gentile idolatry. He is the apostle to the Gentiles. The logical next step is to march into the marketplace and start tearing down the idols with his preaching.
But look at verse 17. Despite being provoked by the Gentiles, the verse says, "So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews." Even when his spirit was burning to confront the pagan culture, the procedural principle of Romans chapter 1 held him in check. He went to the synagogue first, and only after that did he go to the marketplace to debate the philosophers.
The pattern is incredibly consistent. Antioch, Iconium, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth, Ephesus. Everywhere he goes, the apostle to the Gentiles goes to the Jew first. The behavior validates the grammar. But, as with any theological debate, there is pushback.
There always is.
There is one major text critics use to argue that God eventually canceled this mandate. We need to address the counter-argument found at the very end of the book of Acts.
Critics of the ongoing mandate point heavily to Acts chapter 28. In this passage, Paul is a prisoner in Rome. He calls the local Jewish leaders to his lodging and presents the gospel to them. Some believe, but many reject his message. In response to this rejection, Paul quotes a harsh prophecy from Isaiah about their eyes being closed and their ears being dull.
And then he drops the hammer in verse 28. He declares, "Therefore let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will also listen."
Critics latch onto that statement. They argue that this scene in Rome represents a final, permanent breaking point. They claim Paul is announcing that God has shifted the program permanently away from the Jewish people and handed it exclusively to the Gentiles, superseding the Romans chapter 1 mandate forever.
On the surface, if you isolate that one verse, you can see how they arrive at that conclusion. It sounds like a closing statement. But we cannot isolate verses. We have to look at the patterns. If we zoom out, how does this argument hold up against the rest of Paul's ministry?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the critic's argument collapses entirely. We have to compare Paul's statement in Acts chapter 28 to his previous statements in Acts chapter 13 and Acts chapter 18.
Okay, let's make that comparison.
In Acts 13, in Antioch of Pisidia, Paul faced rejection and said, "Since you thrust it aside, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles." In Acts 18, in Corinth, he faced rejection, shook out his garments, and said, "From now on, I will go to the Gentiles."
I see where this is going. He makes the exact same declaration in Antioch and Corinth that he makes in Rome. He says, I am turning to the Gentiles. But here is the critical data point. What did Paul do the moment he traveled to the very next town after making those declarations?
After leaving Antioch of Pisidia, he went to Iconium, and verse 1 of chapter 14 says he entered together into the synagogue of the Jews. After leaving Corinth, he went to Ephesus, and chapter 18, verse 19 says he entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews.
We can deduce the pattern clearly. Paul's shift to the Gentiles was always a local shift, never a global or permanent shift in theology. When the Jewish population of a specific city rejected the message, Paul fulfilled his obligation there and turned to the Gentiles of that specific city.
That is exactly what happened.
But the moment his feet crossed the city limits into new territory, the operating procedure reset. The mandate remained intact wherever he traveled next.
Acts chapter 28 is not a global cancellation of Romans chapter 1. It is simply the local application of the procedure in the city of Rome. The Jewish leadership in Rome rejected the message, so Paul turned to the Gentiles in Rome.
Right.
If the book of Acts had continued and documented Paul traveling to Spain or Gaul, we can be absolutely certain based on his established pattern that his first stop in those new regions would have been the local synagogue.
The counter-argument fails because it ignores the established behavioral rhythm of the apostle. The theological defense of the mandate stands firm. So let us bring the focus back to your immediate reality. What does all of this mean for you, the listener, sitting in a pew on Sunday morning, or the pastor drafting a church budget?
It means we have a responsibility to act on what we know. To summarize our findings, the grammatical structure of Romans chapter 1 establishes a continuous, universal truth. The historical practice of Paul in the book of Acts demonstrates strict adherence to this sequence.
And the confessions agree.
Right, the statements of historic church confessions affirm the necessity of taking the gospel to the Jewish people. All the evidence points to an ongoing, procedural mandate for missions.
And there is a massive blessing attached to obedience here. Fruchtenbaum mentions the promise of the Abrahamic covenant, I will bless those who bless you. Local congregations can appropriate specific blessings by actively taking the gospel to the Jewish people first. It is not just about fulfilling a rule, it is about aligning with God's heart and receiving the resultant blessing.
If Romans chapter 1 is prescriptive, modern believers and churches have a tangible historical debt to honor. We have a clear order of operations for our generosity and our outreach. The passive evangelism of supporting Jewish missions is the most direct way for the majority of believers to participate in this divine sequence.
We have to stop trying to build the fire backwards. We owe the gospel to the Jewish people of our generation, just as much as Paul owed it to the generation of the first century. The dispensation has not changed, and neither has the procedure.
The mechanism remains in place, waiting for the church to utilize it properly.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. If the divine order of operations for reaching the world has been hidden in plain sight all this time, like the paper, wood, and coal of a fire, how might realigning our modern methods to this ancient sequence spark a renewed spiritual awakening in our own cities today? Could it be that our neglect of the paper is the very reason we struggle to ignite the coal? Thank you for joining us today on Reformed Thinking. We will see you next time.